Hi everyone, welcome back to another tutorial video. Last week we talked about getting started in Illustrator and setting up a file. Today we are going to be talking about some of the basic tools of Illustrator and learning about the fun things you can make with them. So without further ado, let's get started. I have my file open from last week's demo, but feel free to open up a new file if you want to. The size of your artboard won't matter since we're just playing with the tools and not working with the space. So the first thing we're going to do is discuss selection tools. So go ahead and just watch what's going on the screen. If you've just opened Illustrator, the default cursor should be the selection tool. It should be a simple black cursor just like this. If your cursor looks any different, go ahead and go to the top left corner and select the first tool. You will know if it's selected if it has a dark background. The selection tool is the most basic tool in Illustrator used for selecting and moving around objects. For example, I'm going to select this pink box and I'm just going to move it around. You can also resize the shape by clicking and dragging these white boxes or transform controls. Every corner on a shape is given one of these circle indicators, which allows you to round the corner by clicking and dragging. You can choose just how round you want these corners to be until they run into another point or a curve. So here you can see I'm pushing it as far as I can, but it won't curve anymore because that's the furthest it can go. So that's basically what the selection tool does. You can also select multiple objects by highlighting all of them. So I'm just going to hit undo or Command Z and go all the way back to where we started. So next we're going to be talking about the direct selection tool, which is kind of like the fraternal twin of the selection tool. To find the direct selection tool, click and hold the selection tool's icon. This will open up a menu with the direct selection tool. You can also hit A for the shortcut. Because of how often you will be using these two tools, I highly recommend you to get used to swapping between A and V. So just like the selection tool, you can select objects and move them around. The difference is, however, that you can select individual points on the shape and adjust them. So the points, or anchor points, are these blue squares that hold the lines of the shape together. By clicking on them with the direct selection tool, you can move the point around without moving the rest of the shape around. This allows you to make more custom shapes like I am doing here. The direct selection tool really allows you to play around with these shapes and have fun with them. And just like the regular selection tool, each of the corners of the shape will still have the circle indicator that allows you to round out the corner. So before we get any further, just like last week when we discussed the difference between RGB and CMYK color profiles, it's important that we discuss the difference between vector and pixel. So if any of you have ever used Photoshop or Procreate or any other photo editing or drawing software, you might know that those softwares are all pixel based. That means that there are literally little physical squares that make up the image. If you zoom into the image, eventually you'll be able to see those little squares. Illustrator, on the other hand, works in vectors. Vectors are mathematical equations that essentially allow you to enlarge the image at any size without the image becoming blurry. Usually, things like photographs will be pixel-based, while things like text and flat graphics will be vector-based. The reason why it's important for you to learn Illustrator or any vector drawing program is because graphic designers tend to work in environments where they need to both scale up and down comfortably. For example, if you draw a logo for a client in Procreate, which by the way is a great way to start, when you hand it over, it will most likely be a JPEG. Now, for most uses, like a business card or stationery, that drawing might be fine. But if your client then needed the logo for a billboard, that logo will look crazy blurry. If you designed it using vectors, you would never need to worry about that issue. Long story short, learn to work with vectors because it will allow you to be a much more versatile designer. Okay, so back to business. I'm going to quickly undo all the way back to the beginning because I think it's important that before we get too far, I teach you how to make some basic shapes. So the first shape we're going to make is a simple rectangle. The rectangle tool is the one with an icon that is literally a rectangle. The shortcut for this tool is M. So with our rectangle tool selected, we can click and drag to create rectangles of any size or shape. We can also hit Shift while we click and drag to create a perfect square. You know if you're doing it right if this pink diagonal line shows up. You may also notice that when you are creating a shape, these measurements show up. These can help you create a shape in the exact size you want. So the next shape tool we're going to use is the ellipse tool. Click and hold the rectangle tool icon and you will see a bunch of other shapes. So go ahead and select the ellipse tool. The shortcut for this tool is L. So the ellipse tool, just like the rectangle tool, you can click and drag to create ovals or hold shift down to create circles. You can tell it's making a circle if it has the pink crosshair that goes through it. There are also other tools you can use to make other specified shapes. Clicking down on the ellipse tool icon, you can see your different options. I'm going to select the polygon tool first. This tool allows you to make any polygon shape. If you want to add more or less sides to the polygon, press the up and down keys on your keyboard. With this, you can make polygons with like a million different sides. That's almost a circle all the way down to a triangle. You can also hit Shift while you're clicking and dragging, and this will always put one of the flat sides of the polygon at the bottom. So here's a hexagon and what it would look like holding Shift. So the next shape tool I'm going to show is Star Tool, which is similar to the Polygon tool, only instead of flat edges, it's spiky edges. So you can do the same thing and use the arrow keys to add more points. So with all of these shapes, you can definitely use the direct selection tool like what we talked about before and select individual points on these shapes and adjust them. This really allows you to take generic shapes and customize them to whatever you're making. It's also kind of just fun to see what kind of cool shapes you can make. The next thing we're going to talk about is color. So if you haven't adjusted any of your colors, your shapes probably are white with a black border. I already had my shapes colored from the last demo, so I'm just going to switch back to the default colors for the sake of this demo. Colors in Illustrator are comprised of fills and strokes. The fill is the color of the body of the shape, and the stroke is the color of the outline of the shape. On the side panel, the white square in front controls the color of the fill, and the black square with a hole in it controls the color of the stroke. So if we double-click the white fill box, we will get a panel that looks like this. This panel will allow you to adjust the color of the fill by moving around the color spectrum or inputting values. So go ahead and take a look at the different colors you can pick. You might also notice that you can actually input RGB and CMYK values. The CMYK percentages are the actual percentages of inks you would use to print that color. The RGB values are the levels of each color light used to display them on a monitor. If you have a specific RGB or CMYK value or a hex code, you can totally just plug them in here. So with the last demo's discussion on RGB versus CMYK, you might notice this little warning symbol that's given next to the color that we've selected. This is to show that this color is actually outside of the CMYK gamut. So what shows up underneath the warning sign is actually what the color will print out like. It will not look like the purple that we selected. So you can just click it to correct it and you'll see that actually the colors aren't that different. But if you're trying to print a really specific color, it's good to pay attention to it. So when you've got the color you like, you can hit OK and see exactly what you've got. So I probably should have chosen a color that was more different than our original one, but we're just going to go with it. Anyways, you can do the same thing with stroke, double click it, select a color you like, and hit OK. Now we've got a lovely square with a purple fill and a yellow stroke. So real quick, 2 navigating tips. You can hit Command plus and minus to zoom in and out on your artboard, or hit Z and click and drag. You can also hit H for the hand tool, or hold down the space bar to use the hand tool to navigate around your artboard. You can also find the hand tool on the left panel. It is literally the one that looks like a hand. So it looks like I cleared everything off and started over. However, actually my computer just crashed. So we're just going to move on and talk about gradients. So gradients are another color option to color your shapes. So I'm just making a rectangle over here with the rectangle tool. And then you might notice that there's actually a gradient square in between the fill and the no colors on the color panel. So we're just going to go ahead and select that gradient. That should make your rectangle look something like this. To adjust your gradient, you're going to need to open up the gradient panel. So mine automatically opened when I adjusted to gradient, but if you cannot find it, as usual, go to the window and select the gradient panel. So mine is already open, so I'm just going to bring it over so you can see it a little bit more clearly and zoom in. Okay, so here we are with the gradient panel. We're going to go through these step by step, but I recommend you just play around with these things and see what they do for yourself. There are 3 different types of gradients. The first one is linear, which is the one we currently have selected. The second one is radial, and this just has a gradient that starts from one point in the center and goes out like a circle. And the third one is freeform, which allows you to create freeform gradients. So we're just going to switch back to the linear gradient to talk about the rest of the things. So you can adjust the angle of the gradient by selecting one of these preset angles or type in your own angle. You can also rotate the gradient slider on top of the box using the gradient tool. To change the colors of the gradient, double-click these circle stops. This will open a color panel. You can select one of these preset colors or click the palette to customize one. You can click on the hamburger menu and then select your color profile. Then you can use these sliders and choose whatever color you want to use. So I'm just going to choose some random color. Looks like it's going to be this kind of ugly green. And we're just going to repeat the same thing on the other side and choose a different color. So for this side, I'm just going to choose like a pink. That's kind of a little muddy gradient, but that's okay. And then below, the third option is to use a color picker, which you can totally just use and select any existing color on your artboard to make your color stop that color. I'm just going to hit undo because I like the previous pink better. But you can also adjust the values of each color using this little diamond in between the stops or moving the stops themselves. You can also add more colors to your gradients by clicking on the gradient slider. You might notice that currently my cursor has a little plus next to it. This indicates that I can click to add something new. So just like the previous stops, I can double click to change the color of it, and I can move it around to adjust the values of it. You can also adjust the values of the gradient using the matching slider that is actually on top of the shape. So for example, this yellow stop that's actually on the shape adjusts the gradient slider just as much as the one on the gradient panel. So from here, you can transform your linear gradient into a radial gradient. This uses the same colors and the same stops, only instead of starting from one point to another, it starts from the center of a circle to the outside of a circle. From here, you can customize your gradient even more, rotating it even though it's a circle, changing the actual shape of the whole circle, making it into an oval, or any of these kinds of little things. Definitely just play around with what these gradients can do, because the only way you'll actually become comfortable with Illustrator is to use it. So finally, the last type of gradient is the freeform gradient, and when you click it, it actually will not save the same colors that you were using in the previous 2 types. You can, however, select each of these little stops and change the colors the way that we have been with the previous 2 types of gradients. I'm just going to select a couple of fun colors to see what we can make. With each of these individual stops, you can pull these surrounding circles out to change the range of each color. Just like the previous types of gradients, you can also click directly to add more stops. These stops can be changed and adjusted the way that the previous ones have as well. The freeform gradients are nice though because you can actually move these stops around randomly and you aren't stuck on a linear or radial pattern. If you ever find yourself maybe with too many stops or you've gone too far, you can always click this delete stop or just hit backspace and get rid of that stop. The same thing works for the previous types of gradients as well. I think I forgot to mention this earlier, but going back to the linear gradient, you can actually rotate the gradients directly using the slider on top of the shape. Additionally, you can also hit this reverse gradient button to reverse the order of the colors of your gradient. And that's about it for gradients. So we will be moving on from colors to building more complex shapes in the next part of this lesson. So click onto the next video and I'll see you guys over there.